They thought she was just another defendant, until the truth shattered the room. She never raised her voice. She never begged. She just watched and waited. By the time they realized who she truly was, it was already too late. The courtroom was already tense before she arrived. It was the kind of morning that felt too ordinary to matador beige walls, the buzz of fluorescent lights, the scrape of shoes on polished linoleum. But the moment the double doors at the back of courtroom 4B creaked open, something subtle shifted. People didn't realize it at first. Only later, when the pieces fell into place, they'd remember the air changed when she walked in. The woman was small in frame, no more than 5'5", wearing a loose, faded jumpsuit and thick soled canvas shoes. Her hands were cuffed in front of her, wrists red where the metal pressed against her skin. A female deputy walked beside her, holding the chain between the cuffs, not roughly but not gently either. The hush in the room wasn't silence, it was something tighter, stretched across the faces of those watching, an anticipation of something they couldn't name. She didn't look down. She didn't shuffle or cry or hesitate. She walked slowly and steadily to the defense table and waited. Her expression was unreadable, not cold, not angry, just ... still. That kind of stillness that makes you lean forward without realizing you're doing it. From the third row, Officer Randy Colton leaned toward his colleague and muttered under his breath, "Another one thinks she's special." His friend smirked and whispered back, "She'll crack in 5 minutes. Watch." They chuckled, not loudly, just enough. Enough to be heard by the people they wanted to hear them. Enough to remind everyone that they belonged here. And she didn't. But the woman didn't flinch. She didn't react at all. Judge Harper, a man with 30 years on the bench and an expression that had long since settled into permanent boredom, adjusted his reading glasses. He looked at the file in front of him, then over his glasses at the defendant, named Kiast. The woman raised her eyes to meet his. Her voice was quiet but clear. "Sophia Bell." The clerk jotted it down, expression neutral. The judge squinted. "Miss Bell, you are currently being held for failure to comply with transit orders, obstruction of a public officer, and trespassing. Do you have legal representation?" There was a pause, long enough for people to shift in their seats, long enough for someone to laugh softly again. "I'll represent myself," she said. It wasn't arrogance in her voice. It wasn't defiance. It was ... calm, unshakable, like she'd thought about this moment long before it arrived, and had already made peace with it. The judge raised an eyebrow. "You're waiving your right to counsel." She nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor." Someone scoffed near the back. A journalist in the second row, Angela Torres, glanced up from her notepad. She hadn't planned to stay for this hearing. Transit violations weren't newsworthy. But there was something about the woman's presence that made her pause, pen hovering above the page. Sophia sat down slowly, the cuffs removed without ceremony by the deputy. She rested her hands gently on the table. She didn't glance at the gallery or the officers. She didn't even blink in the judge's direction again. There was no sound in the courtroom now. No shuffling of papers, no coughs or clicks, just the quiet pull of attention being drawn, whether people wanted to give it or not. The prosecution rose. A young assistant district attorney named Mason, with a reputation for being efficient, polished, and never too emotional. He cleared his throat and spoke with professional confidence. "The state is prepared to demonstrate that." Ms. Bell deliberately ignored multiple lawful commands at the Jefferson Street station. Her actions disrupted operations, created risk, and required forceful removal by 3 responding officers. He said it like it was routine, because it was. Until now, no one interrupted. No one needed to. But Angela, the journalist, was writing again. Something simple. "She doesn't act like someone guilty. She acts like someone waiting for a moment to arrive." Officer Colton leaned back, smirking. "She's playing them. Just wait." But something was changing. No outbursts, no objections, no dramatic pleas or denials. Just Sophia Bell, still and calm, sitting in that chair as if it had always been hers. And that silence, it didn't feel empty. It felt intentional, like she was building something inside it. A question began to rise quietly among the spectators. Who is she? The gallery didn't know yet. Neither did the judge. Not even the prosecutor sensed what was coming. But one person did. In the far left corner of the room, near the wall, a man in a navy suit with no name tag and no notepad watched without blinking. He didn't speak. He didn't write anything down. He simply observed. expression unreadable. And every time Sophia moved even slightly, his eyes followed. The rest of the courtroom thought this was a routine case, a minor public disruption by another name in a long list of people society expected to fall into place. But Sophia didn't look like someone who had fallen out of place. She looked like someone who had stepped into it, with purpose. And the deeper question, the one people would only begin to ask after the truth came out, was why she was here at all. Because Sophia Bell wasn't just another defendant, and this courtroom wasn't just a place of judgment. It was about to become the place where a truth, long hidden, came crashing into the light, not with shouting or chaos, but with stillness that demanded to be seen. And soon, everyone would understand. But not yet. Not today. Today was for watching her, and wondering what came next. The courtroom buzzed with unspoken tension as day 2 began. Some of the same faces returned, not because the case was dramatic, but because they couldn't shake the feeling that something about it wasn't right. People claimed they were just curious about the woman representing herself, about what she'd say next. But that wasn't it. Not really. They returned because of how she made them feel. Sophia Bell had spoken only a handful of words the day before, yet somehow, it was more memorable than any outburst or plea. She hadn't defended herself, hadn't even reacted, and that stillness, that silence was louder than most people knew how to handle. The courtroom doors opened again at 9 a.m. sharp. She stepped inside, wearing the same faded jumpsuit, her hair tied back in a simple bun. The deputies flanked her again, though this time with less force in their steps. One of them, a younger woman named Deputy Kerr, held her a little less tightly than the day before. Just barely, but it mattered. When Sophia reached the defense table and sat down, she did so with the same quiet grace. No fumbling, no nervous fidgeting. She folded her hands and waited. Judge Harper entered minutes later. He scanned the courtroom, adjusted his glasses again, and took his seat. No smile, no welcome. Just the tired routine of a man used to being listened to without challenge. "We'll continue with preliminary statements," he said, glancing at the prosecutor. "Mr. Mason." The assistant district attorney stood confidently, buttoned his jacket, and approached the jury box. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you'll see today is straightforward. A woman resisting lawful orders in a crowded public space. Her refusal to cooperate endangered commuters and caused a scene that required police response. This isn't about race, or gender, or anything beyond that. Simple fact, actions have consequences." He turned to gesture subtly at Sophia, and this defendant chose to escalate a situation that should have been resolved with one word: compliance. It was the same voice he'd used in dozens of cases, professional, firm, direct. The kind of voice meant to close doors, not open them. Sophia didn't react. Her face, once again, was unreadable. But in the gallery, one hand shifted a single gesture from the man in the navy suit, who still hadn't said a word. This time, he reached into his pocket, removed a pen, and began jotting something into a small leather notebook. Angela, the journalist, noticed. She had a talent for watching the watchers, and she was starting to wonder who that man really was. The judge looked toward Sophia. "Miss Bell, do you have anything to add before we proceed with witness statements?" She stood slowly, not in protest, but as if stretching into her own authority. "Yes, Your Honor," she said softly. It was the way she said it that made everyone listen, not loud, not rushed, just steady, grounded. "I would like to present a statement before the first witness is called." The judge glanced down at the docket, mildly annoyed. "A written statement?" "No," she replied, looking him in the eye for the first time that morning. "A spoken one." Brief. There was a pause. He gestured reluctantly. "Proceed." Sophia turned not to the judge, but to the jury. She didn't pace, she didn't gesture. She simply looked at each person one by one, her voice even and steady. "You have been told this is a simple case, that what you'll see is someone who disobeyed, someone who refused, someone who caused a scene. I ask only this: look at the full picture. Not what you're told to see, but what you actually see." She turned her hands, pumped slightly. Sometimes what looks like silence is something else. Sometimes it's observation, listening, waiting for truth to rise above noise. Then she sat down. The silence that followed was not awkward, it was charged, as if the room itself had taken a breath but wasn't sure how to exhale. And for the first time, Prosecutor Mason looked unsettled. The judge cleared his throat, trying to reassert rhythm. We'll begin with the first witness. Officer Randy Colton, take the stand." The officer stood, straightened his uniform, and walked forward with the kind of self-assurance that came from being listened to without question for years. He was tall, built like someone who never missed the gym, and spoke with a practiced, casual tone. On the day in question, he began. The defendant was causing a disturbance at Jefferson Station. She refused to comply with officers, created a safety issue, and had to be escorted out. He looked at the jury as if daring them to question him, but Sophia watched him closely, not with challenge, with precision. When it was time for cross-examination, she rose again. "Officer Colton," she said, "you stated that I was yelling at officers and refusing orders. Did your body camera capture this interaction?" He blinked, slightly thrown by the directness of the question. "Yes, it did." "Will that footage be submitted today?" He hesitated. "It's under review." "So, it was recorded?" "Yes." She nodded. "And were there other civilians nearby?" "Yes." "Did any of them intervene on my behalf?" He shifted slightly. "1 or 2. But that's not unusual in public disturbances." Sophia tilted her head gently. "Did anyone accuse you of using unnecessary force?" He leaned back, his voice tightening. "We followed protocol." She said nothing for a beat. Then, "Thank you, officer." She returned to her seat. It wasn't the questions themselves that unsettled the courtroom, it was the way she asked them, calm, focused, not to discredit, but to reveal. As the day wore on, 2 more officers testified. Their stories lined up well enough. They used the word uncooperative multiple times, non-compliant, passive resistance. No one said she'd shouted. No one said she'd struck out. She hadn't, but they leaned heavily into tone, using words that carried weight without evidence. Angela kept writing. Only now, her words looked less like notes and more like the bones of a story. And that man in the navy suit, he closed his notebook halfway through the second testimony and simply watched again, closer this time, like someone waiting for a very specific moment. By 3:45 p.m., Judge Harper called for recess. The crowd stood slowly, buzzing again with whispers and quick glances. Sophia remained seated until most of the room had emptied. Then, she stood and turned. Deputy Kerr approached her with the cuffs, then hesitated. "You don't seem nervous," she said quietly. Sophia looked at her with a faint smile. "Not cold, not warm, just knowing, because I'm not," she said. And as she was led from the room, a dozen unspoken questions remained behind. Who was she, really? What was she here to prove? And why did the man in the navy suit follow her out of the courtroom, staying 3 steps behind, but never taking his eyes off her? Whatever story the courtroom thought they were telling Sophia, Bell had a different version, and it hadn't even begun yet. The next morning, the air inside courtroom 3C felt heavier, not with anger or impatience, but with the quiet weight of unspoken curiosity. Something was happening here, and everyone knew it. They just didn't have the language for it yet. Sophia Bell had become more than a defendant overnight. People who hadn't even followed the case before were now showing up: law students, off-duty officers, retired court clerks, and even a few parents with teens in tow. There were no posters or protests, just a crowd drawn by something quieter, but no less powerful. By 8:50 a.m., every seat was filled. The man in the navy suit returned as well. Today, he sat in a new spot, 1 row closer, with the same stillness in his body and the same notebook in his lap, closed again. A few people assumed he was pressed. Others thought maybe an attorney or someone from internal affairs, but he wasn't listed on any official court roster, and he never took notes when the testimony started. Only when Sophia spoke. At exactly 9 a.m., she walked in, still in that orange jumpsuit, still flanked by guards, but today, something had shifted. Even the guards noticed. They didn't hold her like someone dangerous. They escorted her like someone important. They didn't know why they felt that, but they did. She took her seat, slowly, one hand resting gently on the desk, the other folded in her lap. Judge Harper entered a moment later, his robes shifting as he sat down. "Let's begin," he said. "Prosecution, call your next witness." The next witness was Officer Denise Ashford Sr., patrol officer, 20 years on the force, and someone known for her composure under pressure. Her presence carried authority, and when she stepped into the witness stand, she looked like someone who'd been called to tell the truth. Only this time, even she seemed ... cautious. "Mr. Mason," The prosecutor went through the routine. Time, place, incident. Officer Ashford confirmed the basics. She'd arrived at Jefferson Station shortly after the initial call. She saw a crowd. She saw Sophia standing calmly by the ticket machines. She saw 2 officers trying to speak with her, and she saw the moment things escalated. "What did you observe the defendant doing?" Mason asked. She was quiet. Ashford said carefully, "Didn't argue, just ... didn't respond." So she was ignoring direct orders. She wasn't being aggressive, Ashford clarified. But yes, she wasn't cooperating either, at least not verbally. Mason nodded. "And how did she physically respond when approached?" "She allowed herself to be cuffed," Ashford replied. "Didn't resist, didn't fight, but she did look each officer in the eye." "In what way?" Ashford paused. "I've seen fear in people's eyes before, panic, even rage, but she didn't show any of that. It was more like ... patience." Some jurors tilted their heads slightly. "Thank you," Mason said quickly, trying to regain control of the moment. No further questions. Sophia rose slowly, walked toward the stand. "Officer Ashford," she began, "you've served for 2 decades. Yes. In your experience, have you ever witnessed someone who remains calm during arrest?" "Yes." "Do you usually find that threatening?" "No, not usually." Sophia stepped a little closer, not aggressively, but just enough to close the emotional distance. "Did you feel threatened by me?" Ashford didn't answer right away. "No," she said, "not threatened. But you still followed the arrest protocol?" "Yes, standard procedure." Sophia nodded. "So you followed a system, even though your instinct said otherwise?" Ashford's lips pressed together. "I followed policy." "Understood," Sophia said gently. "Thank you for your honesty." She returned to her seat without another word. But the seed had been planted. It wasn't about breaking rules anymore. It was about why the rules had been applied when the situation hadn't demanded them. It was about seeing the difference between behavior and assumptions. After a short recess, the judge returned with news. "Body cam footage has been cleared for partial admission," he announced. "We'll play the segment provided by the prosecution." A large screen was rolled into place. The lights dimmed slightly, and the video began. It was shaky at first, typical of police body cam footage. Crowds moving, overlapping voices, the hum of a train approaching. Then came Sophia. She stood at the kiosk, holding a transit card, quiet, alone, not yelling, not blocking anything. An officer approached. "Ma'am, we need you to step aside." She didn't respond. He repeated the command. Still no response. Another officer joined. More commands. Sophia looked up, not in defiance, just calmly. Then one officer said, "You match a description we received. Need you to cooperate." That phrase echoed. "You match the description." A few jurors exchanged glances. Next on the footage, hands reached for her wrists. She didn't pull away. She was cuffed and walked out of frame. End of clip. The lights came back up, but something in the room had dimmed. Prosecutor Mason tried to spin it. As you can see, refusal to comply required intervention. But the footage had exposed something different. No threats, no resistance, no crimes, just assumption. The judge called for lunch, recess. As people began filing out, a reporter whispered to another, "She didn't match a crime, just a description." And that, somehow, was even harder to explain. Outside, in the hallway, the man in the navy suit made his first move. He didn't approach Sophia. He approached Angela, the journalist who'd been scribbling furiously since day one. He handed her a card, Raymond Ellis. It read, "No job title, no agency, just a number." "Who are you?" she asked. He didn't answer, just said, "Keep watching," then disappeared into the crowd. Back inside the courtroom, Sophia stood by the window, hands clasped behind her back, staring into the sunlight pouring through the narrow glass. She knew what was coming. The courtroom thought they were on day 3 of a routine case, but they were wrong. The real testimony hadn't started yet. She wasn't here to win the jury. She was here to expose the system. And the only question now was, who would be brave enough to look when the mask came off? The day didn't feel like a trial anymore. It felt like something else, like a quiet reckoning. As if the truth had been pacing in the hallway for too long and was finally walking in uninvited. By the time the court reconvened after lunch, the mood had changed. Not officially, of course. The judge still wore the same expression. The court officers still stood with the same practiced stillness, but the silence had a new kind of weight. It was the kind of silence that comes before something important, not after. Sophia Morgan walked in without guards holding her elbows this time. They still followed, but slower, more distant, like they weren't sure if they were escorting a suspect or witnessing someone they'd misjudged. This time even, the audience didn't whisper, they just watched. The judge adjusted his glasses, clearly trying to re-establish control. "Defense may proceed," he said, and Sophia rose. Not with hesitation but with certainty, as if she'd been waiting for this part all along. "I would like to call a witness," she said clearly. "Officer Reginald Blake." A pause. Blake, the loudest of the officers, the same one who had laughed on day one, muttering "Lady Mute" under his breath. He shifted in his seat now, not laughing anymore. He stood and approached the stand with swagger still in his walk, but less in his eyes. Still, he didn't look nervous, not yet. "Do you swear to tell the truth?" the bailiff asked. "I do," Blake replied. Sophia stepped forward slowly. "Officer Blake," she began, "you were among the first to interact with me on the day of my arrest." "Yes." "You approached me with the intent to assess a potential threat, correct?" "Yes." "Did I respond violently?" "No." "Did I raise my voice?" "No." "Did I attempt to flee?" "No." "So why did you place me in cuffs?" Blake shifted in his chair. "You weren't responding." And is silence a crime? Blake opened his mouth, but no answer came. "I'll rephrase," Sophia said calmly. "Do you regularly detain people for not speaking to you?" "Depends on the context." "And what was the context that day?" He hesitated. "There was a report of suspicious activity." "What kind of suspicious activity?" Blake glanced at the judge, then back at Sophia. "Someone reported a woman loitering by the kiosk. Said she looked... tense." Sophia paused. "So, I was standing alone, quiet, not interfering, and that was considered tension enough to call officers?" "Yes." "And do you recall the exact words you used when you approached me?" Blake frowned. "Not exactly." Sophia turned toward the screen set up for video playback. "I'd like to submit a second clip into evidence," she said. "This one taken from a nearby bystander's phone." The judge looked surprised but nodded. "Proceed." The video played, shakier than the official body cam, but the audio was unmistakable. Blake's voice came through clearly. "Look, you match the description. Stop playing games and speak up. Then, you people always want to act like you're above following the rules." Gasps rose from the gallery, not because of the tone but because of the implication. Sophia let the clip play out. She didn't have to explain it. She knew the silence would. When it ended, she looked back at Blake. "Would you like to explain what you meant by you people?" Blake opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Sophia's voice was quiet but unshakable. "Do you recall laughing as I was escorted into court on the first day?" "I didn't mean anything by it," he muttered. "I never said you did," she replied. "But what we don't mean often reveals more than what we say intentionally." The courtroom was still. No one objected, not even the prosecutor, because something bigger than cross-examination was happening here. It wasn't just a defense, it was a mirror, and everyone was being forced to look into it. The judge cleared his throat. "That's enough," he said, but even he didn't sound convinced. Sophia stepped back, calm, precise, controlled. The next witness she called wasn't an officer, or a civilian, or even a legal expert. It was an 8-year-old boy. His name was Elijah Monroe. He sat on the witness stand, swinging his feet nervously, his small hands clutching the edges of the wooden seat. Sophia knelt down beside him, her voice soft. "Elijah, do you remember what happened the day you saw me at the station?" He nodded. "You were helping me find my bus card." Soft murmurs echoed through the room. "And what happened after that?" "Some men yelled at you. You didn't do anything wrong. You were just helping." "Elijah," Sophia said gently, "did I ever scare you?" He shook his head quickly. "No. You smiled at me. You said to be careful crossing the street." Sophia nodded, then turned to the jury. No further questions. The prosecution didn't even cross-examine him, because they couldn't. After Elijah stepped down, a strange thing happened. One by one, people who had never planned to testify started raising their hands. A woman who had been riding the train that day, a maintenance worker who saw Sophia helping a man with a disability exit the platform, a local transit officer who had filed a report on another officer's use of force that was buried quietly months before. Each story wasn't explosive, but together, they painted something far more powerful than outrage. They painted truth, not in bright, dramatic strokes but in quiet layers, one on top of the other, slowly, steadily until the image became too clear to ignore. At the defense table, Sophia remained silent now, because she had nothing to say, but because she didn't need to say anything more. The story was being told, piece by piece, and the courtroom was no longer just watching, they were listening. The judge called for the day to close, but as Sophia rose, the man in the navy suit finally stood as well. He walked to the front, handed a sealed envelope to the bailiff, and said, loud enough for the entire room to hear, "This belongs in the record." The judge looked puzzled but curious. "What is it?" The man's answer was quiet, but clear: her badge. And just like that, the courtroom wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was history in the making, and the world was about to find out exactly who Sophia Morgan really was. The ripple didn't start with shock. It started with a breath-a-long, collective inhale the moment the judge opened the envelope. The courtroom was silent, still balancing on the edge of disbelief and awakening. Judge Marlowe turned over the contents slowly, his brow furrowing as he removed a simple ID card and a folded letter, both sealed with the unmistakable insignia of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He looked up at Sophia, whose expression hadn't changed.com/measured. Present. She wasn't waiting for anyone to validate her. She was simply allowing the moment to arrive on its own. "Ms. Morgan," the judge said, carefully now, as though even her name carried a different weight. "Would you care to explain this?" Sophia stood, not defensively, not proudly, just honestly. "I will, Your Honor," she replied, "but only if the court is ready to hear it." It was not arrogance that filled the room. It was accountability on the verge of becoming undeniable. The judge nodded. Sophia walked to the center of the courtroom and gently took the letter from the judge's outstretched hand. Her eyes scanned it not because she needed to remember what it said, but because some truths deserve to be read twice before they are spoken aloud. "I didn't come here to defend myself," she began. "I came here to expose something far more important than my own story. This case was never about trespassing. It was never about resisting. It was about perception, and what happens when perception is poisoned." She turned toward the jury. "I've worked for the Bureau for over 19 years. I am a regional intelligence director, trained in behavioral analysis, covert operations, and field risk assessment. What brought me here wasn't a mistake, it was an assignment." The words landed without flair. They didn't need it. The jury leaned in. The prosecution froze. The officers on the side bench stiffened, but not from discipline. This was something colder. Realization. "I was embedded," Sophia continued. "My purpose was to investigate patterns of procedural misconduct, specifically as it relates to race-based assumptions during civilian interactions. I volunteered for this case. I orchestrated my arrest after several complaints were buried under bureaucracy. What I discovered was worse than what I was sent here to confirm." She paused, not for drama but to let the truth echo. "This courtroom wasn't just a test of me," she said. "It was a test of itself." For the first time, the judge didn't interrupt. He was listening now, not from the bench, but as a human being. Sophia motioned to the screen behind her again. "This," she said, pointing to the body cam footage, still paused from earlier, "is how an innocent interaction between an adult and a child was framed as a threat." She clicked forward. A time-stamped log appeared on screen. Internal emails from the Transit Division. "Here," she said, "is where Officer Blake's report was altered before submission. Here is where the footage was edited, cutting off the moment I clearly identified myself to a nearby officer before being detained anyway. And here," she tapped one final entry, "is where a formal complaint filed by another bystander was marked as resolved without incident, despite no one ever reviewing the footage." Gasps again, but this time they weren't dramatic. They were quiet, heavy, full of recognition. "This wasn't just about me," Sophia said. "It's about how easily the system can turn a quiet citizen into a convenient narrative, how fast an assumption becomes a charge, and how rarely that story is ever challenged, unless someone like me decides to live it on purpose." One juror wiped her eyes. Another leaned back, arms crossed but not in anger, in discomfort, because truth isn't always gentle. The prosecution finally stood. "Your Honor, with respect, this development changes the nature of the proceedings entirely." The judge held up a hand. "It doesn't change what happened," he said. "It reveals it." And with that, he turned to Sophia again. "Do you wish to continue, Director Morgan?" A beat. Then Sophia answered with the calm that had never left her from the moment she entered the courtroom. "Yes, but not just for me." She reached for a stack of printed pages and held them up. "These are transcripts of internal interviews, complaints, and documented inconsistencies gathered over 2 years from this department. They've been submitted to the Department of Justice and to Internal Affairs, but I want them heard here, in public, because injustice doesn't disappear just because it's filed away. It thrives in silence." And then she did something unexpected. She sat down, not at the defense table, but beside the young reporter, Thomas, who had been watching from day one. "You've been paying attention," she said to him quietly. "Tell the story." He blinked. "You want me to write this?" "No," she replied. "I want you to tell it. Truth isn't paperwork, it's people." As Thomas looked around the courtroom, he finally understood what she meant. This wasn't just a trial. It was a reveal of the subtle machinery behind decisions, the invisible biases behind assumptions, and the silent harm of unchecked power. Outside the courthouse, the first press vans were already arriving. Inside, a judge reread the credentials he had once ignored, and seated among strangers who had once scoffed at her, Sophia Morgan didn't have to prove anything anymore, because she never came to win a case. She came to awaken a room, and the room was finally waking up. The silence outside the courthouse was different from the one inside. It wasn't heavy, it was electric, a quiet, charged with the weight of something long overdue. The kind of silence that hangs right before a storm breaks or a truth begins to rise. When Sophia Morgan stepped onto the courthouse steps, there were no flashing lights, no blaring sirens, no dramatic escort flanking her. Just a woman walking calmly into the sunlight, documents tucked neatly under her arm, eyes forward, spine unbent. And then, as if on cue, the questions came. A dozen reporters surged forward, microphones, camera booms, snapping shut, one hungry for a soundbite. But Sophia didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush. She simply turned to the crowd and said what she had always known to be true. "Sometimes," she began, "you have to let people underestimate you long enough for them to reveal who they really are." There were no applause, not yet, just stillness. And then the first question. "Director Morgan, were you afraid this operation would backfire?" She looked at the reporter and smiled gently. "I was never afraid of failing. I was only afraid of what would continue if no one said anything." Another voice. "Why not reveal yourself sooner? Why go through all of this quietly?" Sophia's eyes scanned the crowd, because the point wasn't to make noise. The point was to listen, to show, not tell. "I didn't need to prove I was right. I needed the system to prove itself wrong." A murmur spread. Behind her, the courtroom slowly emptied, jurors walking out, not with indifference, but with something heavier, reflection. Officers stepped aside without smirks, now, their uniforms still crisp, but their posture less sure. Change doesn't always arrive with a banner. Sometimes, it slips in with a whisper. Back inside, Judge Marlowe sat alone in his chambers, staring at a name on his docket that now read differently. Director Sophia Morgan. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had once mispronounced it, overlooked it. Now, he couldn't stop repeating it. He reached for the phone, a private line. He didn't call for PR. He didn't call for protection. He called for accountability. Outside, Thomas was already sending his article draft to the newsroom, but not before he added one final line at the end. "She walked in as a defendant. She walked out as a mirror, and none of us saw the reflection." As the story broke nationwide, headlines erupted, but for once, not just about scandal or outrage. They spoke of restraint, of bravery, of exposure without destruction, of a system held up to its own light. Social media flooded with Sophia's image, not handcuffed in court, but standing tall, speaking truth. The hashtags trended globally. Hashtag the quiet truth. Hashtag Director Morgan. Hashtag justice. Without shouting hashtag truth. Stand still. But Sophia wasn't on her phone. She wasn't watching any of it unfold. She was standing by the same bus stop where it all began. The little girl she'd once sat beside, now holding a sketchbook, ran up to her with wide eyes. "You're on TV," the girl whispered. "I know," Sophia said, kneeling to eye level. "But more importantly, you're here, and still drawing." The girl opened the sketchbook to a new page. It was a picture of Sophia, not in a suit, not in handcuffs, just sitting on a bench, watching the world. "Can I keep this one?" Sophia asked. The girl nodded, then whispered, "Are you famous now?" Sophia smiled. "No, I'm just finally visible." Because that was the lesson, wasn't it? It was never about shouting the loudest. It was about standing long enough, still enough, and true enough, that the world had to turn and see you. In time, internal investigations led to retraining protocols, transparent audits, and a wider national conversation about how stories begin. Who gets to tell them? But for Sophia, the real victory was quieter than policy. It was in the pause before a judgment, the second thought before a label, the breath before a verdict. Her legacy wasn't her title, it was the stillness she taught others to sit with. And in that stillness, something finally broke open, not chaos, but clarity. And the hope that next time, when a woman walks into a room with calm eyes and steady breath, they'll ask her name before assuming her story. Because justice doesn't always need to shout. Sometimes, it just needs to stand still and be heard anyway.